Hi students, in this video we're going to talk about the case State versus Leidholm. This case is from 1983, or was decided in 1983, and involves a husband-wife couple, Janice and Chester Leidholm. There's a picture of Chester here. And Chester is the victim in this case. Janice Leidholm killed him, and I couldn't find a good picture of Janice, so otherwise I'd have her here. But we're going to talk about the circumstances surrounding Chester's death and questions about battered woman syndrome and how we should prosecute people in that kind of situation. So if we look at the facts, we learn that Janice Leidholm and her husband Chester were in an unhappy relationship marked by alcohol abuse and violence. So both drank. My understanding is a fair bit. Chester is an alcoholic and was violent towards Janice. On August 6, 1981, the two of them attended a gun club party where they both drank to excess, so they were both drinking too much. On their way home, they got into an argument that turned physical, and at one point, Janice tried to call the police, but Chester pushed her to the ground away from the phone. So Chester's sort of obviously stronger than Janice here and can prevent her from calling the police or getting in touch with law enforcement generally. At another point in the argument, they sort of moved outside where Chester again pushed Janice to the ground, and each time Janice tried to get up, Chester would push her back down to the ground. So, as hard as this is, to imagine, we want to sort of appreciate, what's going on here. Obviously, Chester is controlling Janice and is like a physically superior, stronger than she is. That night, Janice waited for Chester to fall asleep, and after he did, she got out of bed and grabbed a butcher's knife from the kitchen. She returned to the bedroom and stabbed Chester, who died shortly thereafter. Now, Janice admitted that she killed Chester, right? That's not in question. But she noted that she lived with battered woman syndrome and that she was acting in self-defense. So she says, what I did was an act of self-defense, right? I know Chester wasn't threatening me in the moment, but I was sort of, he was stronger than me, I was outmatched, and I killed him in his sleep to protect myself from being harmed. So the question that this raises is this question about, should Janice be excused for acting in self-defense even though she wasn't in any danger when she killed her husband? So we're going to sort of ask this question a bit more carefully in a minute, but for right now, we just sort of want to ask this question: should she be excused for what she did? Okay, in order to answer that question, we need to draw a distinction between what are called justifications on the one hand and excuses on the other hand. So let's talk about justification first. An illegal act is justified when the actual circumstances that someone's in make something legal when that thing would otherwise be illegal. So let's look at an example. An ambulance driver, right, is justified in breaking a law that prohibits vehicles from entering a public park when there's someone seriously injured inside that park. Okay, so I had like too much time on my hands years ago when I was first doing this stuff, and I made some pretty cool slides here, so prepare yourself. This is going to be great. Okay, so let's say we've got a park and we've got a sign, no vehicles beyond this point. We've got a kid like writhing in pain on the ground. He got kicked or tripped or whatever in soccer, and they call the ambulance, and the ambulance driver comes to the rescue, past the sign that says no vehicles beyond this point and over to the kid to help, fix him up, take him to the hospital, whatever. So the ambulance driver broke the law, right? The law said no vehicles beyond this point, but the ambulance driver was justified because it was doing a good thing. The law wants to encourage and allow ambulances to break laws like this in order to bring about good consequences, or whatever the case may be here. So that's justified. Another classic example, someone's, fallen down into a well or something, and you hear them screaming, but they're on private property that says no trespassing. You're allowed to trespass to save that person's life. Even if it's technically illegal, you're going to be able to defend yourself by saying, hey, I was justified. This was a good thing. You wanted me to save this person's life. And that's more important than following the trespassing law. All right, the kid goes into the ambulance drives off. Everyone's happy. This is good. So now let's look at excuses. So an illegal act is excused when it's reasonable to believe that the circumstances make legal what would otherwise be illegal. So in the last case, the circumstances actually made it a good thing to break the law. In a case of excuse, the circumstances don't make breaking the law a good thing, but they make it reasonable to think that breaking the law was a good thing. So let's take another look at our example. So an ambulance driver, I want to say, is excused for violating a law that prohibits vehicles from entering a certain public park when it's reasonable for the driver to believe that there is someone seriously injured inside the park. So same sort of situation. We see a kid writhing in pain on the ground. It says no vehicles beyond this point. The ambulance driver, drives up to the scene, and when they get there, they find out the person wasn't actually injured. We've got this cartoon here. How was practice? And the girl says, great, we worked on our fake injury skills today. So the reason the kid was writhing in pain on the ground wasn't because he was actually injured, just because he was practicing being injured, right? This is kind of funny because soccer players are sort of known for pretending to be injured when really they're not. They're just trying to get a penalty on the other team. So they fall down and flop around on the ground a little bit, even when they're perfectly fine, hoping that the ref will think, oh yeah, that looked bad, I should call a penalty. So if that happened, the ambulance sees it and drives in. The thought is the ambulance would be excused for driving in, not justified, because it's not really doing any good for the ambulance to drive onto the soccer field or whatever, or into the park, but it is excused because we can see why it was reasonable to think that it was a good thing for the ambulance to drive onto the field. Okay, that's the difference between justification and excuse. If we think about the well example, right? If you don't, maybe there's not a person drowning in a well, but if they sort of yell, I'm drowning, or I'm stuck, help me, and you go in to help them, but really it was like a trick or something, you can say, well, I know I wasn't justified, I didn't have anything good to do. Maybe you were just, the well was making this echo and it sounded like someone was calling for help or whatever. You say, well, I guess I didn't have anything real great to do. I ended up not really having a great reason to be here, but it was reasonable for me to think that I had a good reason to be here. And that's what happens in a case of excuse. All right, so in this case, the ambulance leaves without helping anyone. Okay, so here's another scenario. So imagine that you're just standing around and you've got a bat like this. And this is I should note, probably my most amazingly produced slide in history. So prepare yourself for what's about to happen. Okay, so you're standing around with a bat, and suddenly a crazed looking clown comes running at you with a knife. So here he comes. I'm gonna get you. That's a scary dude. Okay, and so you take your bat and you hit it, and the baseball that falls out of nowhere, I don't know, maybe you have a baseball you tossed up, and you hit the clown and you knock him out. Okay, were you justified? Were you excused? I want to say killing the clown is justified if that clown was actually going to kill you. right? If he was really coming at you with a butcher's knife and he was gonna like chop you up into little bits, then you were justified in hitting him and knocking him out with a baseball. Killing the clown or knocking him out, right? We don't have to go to killing, I guess. That's excused if it was reasonable for you to think that he was going to kill you. So maybe it turns out that that was really just your friend in a clown costume with a rubber knife, and he was just trying to scare you. It's still okay, right? The law shouldn't punish you for doing what you did because it's sort of reasonable for you to do it. But it's not justified because it wasn't actually a good thing for you to do. The law doesn't really want you knocking out fake clowns or fake, crazed-looking murderers or something like that. Okay, so to return to the case, right? Now that we've got this understanding of the difference between justifications and excuses, we can take a look back at the case and think, well, should Janice be excused? So the trial court instructed the jury to find Janice Leidholm guilty unless it believed that a reasonably prudent person in Janice's position would have thought that Chester was about to kill or do seriously bodily harm to her. So the thought here is like, we want the trial court to sort of put themselves in Janice's position. Imagine they're a reasonably prudent person and ask themselves, was it reasonable to think that Chester was about to kill her or about to do serious bodily harm to her? So this is going to be a controversial instruction, right? Janice is going to argue that the court was wrong to instruct the jury in this way. And what she's going to say more specifically is that what matters isn't what a reasonably prudent person in her position would have believed, but rather what it was reasonable for her to believe. So the distinction is between like, what would just sort of an average, ordinary person in her position think, and what would she think, given her experience and the fact that she was living with battered woman syndrome. So this distinction between what a reasonable person, an ordinary reasonable person would believe, and what it would be reasonable for Janice to believe, is getting at this distinction between objective and subjective reasonableness. So when we talk about objective reasonableness, we're talking about beliefs that a reasonably prudent person would form if they have sort of the ordinary psychological and physical characteristics. So an agent's belief is objectively reasonable when a reasonably prudent person with a sort of ordinary physical and psychological characteristics would form that belief in the relevant circumstances. What would the typical person in Janice's position be thinking in this scenario? An agent's belief is subjectively reasonable if a reasonably prudent person with the agent's physical and psychological characteristics would form that belief in the relevant circumstances. So here there's a distinction between sort of ordinary physical and psychological characteristics on the one hand and the agent's physical and psychological characteristics on the other hand. So with subjective reasonableness, we're not asking what would the typical reasonable person think. We're asking what is it reasonable for that particular person to think given the details about their physical makeup, their psychological makeup, and that sort of thing. And what Janice is ultimately going to argue, right, is that the fact that she was living with battered woman syndrome is a sort of important psychological characteristic that's going to affect what she takes to be reasonable, what she takes to be unreasonable. And so she's going to potentially use that, right, to argue that her behavior should be excused. So, to return to the facts, right, Janice argued that her behavior should not be evaluated using an objective standard of reasonableness. Rather, it should be evaluated using a subjective standard of reasonableness that acknowledges the fact that she was living with battered woman syndrome. The thought here is that if we use a subjective standard of reasonableness to evaluate Janice's behavior, then we're going to conclude that it was reasonable for her to think that she needed to kill Chester in his sleep to save her life. So the thought here is that like she's physically outmatched. If they sort of fight in the sort of ordinary situation maybe we think about when we think about self-defense, if there's just like, they know they're fighting for their lives or something, then Chester's going to win. So how does Janice protect herself from Chester? The only way for her to do it is for her to attack him while he's sleeping. That's the way that she can sort of get the upper hand. That's the way she's going to be able to protect herself. So let's talk a little bit about battered woman syndrome and how this affects Janice's thinking. So battering cycles are sort of the hallmark, or the sort of the telltale sign, right, of battered woman syndrome. And these cycles are made up of 3 distinct stages. So the first stage is what we call the tension building stage, where the abuser engages in minor battering incidents and verbal abuse, while the abused person attempts to placate him or her. So the idea here is that in a sort of abusive relationship, the abuser is going to like harm, have these minor harms towards the abused. And the abused person is going to sort of like try and make the other person happy, right? Do whatever they can to not aggravate the abuser. The second stage is the acute battering incident. So the acute battering incident is one where the tension between the abuser and the abused boils over, and the abuser engages in some like significant battering act. This might be caused by some sort of outside event or some sort of provocation of the provocation of the abused. So, exactly what causes it isn't particularly important. The fact is just that like these small instances aren't enough. We get this large incident. The last stage of the battering cycle is this reconciliation stage. And I guess misleading to call it the last stage, the last of the 3. But like I said, it's a cycle. So we go through these in a repetitive sort of way. The reconciliation stage is one where the abuser begs for forgiveness and promises to change their ways, right, to reform. This stage might be followed by a period of relative calm, but eventually it's going to be followed by the tension building stage, starting back up. So, tension's building, acute incident, reconciliation, the person says, oh, I'm so sorry, like I went too far, I'm going to get better, I'm going to change my ways, and maybe they do for a time, but eventually they start engaging in minor battering incidents and verbal abuse again, and things, the pattern continues on. So if we want to just sort of look at the cycle, right, you might imagine there's tension building, these small incidents. We move to an acute battering incident, a bigger deal. The abuser tries to reconcile, apologizes, does everything they can to sort of, make things better, promise to change. But then eventually we get back to the tension building stage, and we just go through that cycle over and over again. Okay, so that's the kind of pattern we would expect to see in someone who's living with battered woman syndrome. But the question you might think is this one. So why don't women just leave abusive partners, or men as well, right, if they have an abusive partner? But why don't people leave these abusive partners? And this, I think, is the other side of the battered woman syndrome. So because of the cyclical nature of the abuse, the abused feel like things are going to get better. So that's one reason, right? None of these is like a definitive reason. They all play a slight role, though, and some may be more significant for different people. But this one is obviously significant. The fact that there's this reconciliation makes them think, oh man, finally, this is over. It's going to get better. And maybe it does for a time, but then it sort of, we get back into the cycle. Second, maybe they perceive abuse as normal. So maybe this is all their relationship has ever been. It's always had this cycle. Maybe they've been with other people who have been abusive. Maybe they were abused as children or something like that. So one thing that keeps people from getting out of this is that the abuse becomes normalized. And I think this is just how things are. Another reason, right, they sort of sink into a state of psychological paralysis. So they seem unable to get away from the abusive partner because the person's placating them, they feel like things are going to get better, they think things are normal, they think, what's the use? There are sort of a bunch of different explanations. One I think we're going to talk about here in a second is just they feel like there's no one they can go to help them, right? They feel like they're really stuck because the abuser has this sort of air of invincibility or power over them. So they think that resistance is hopeless, right? If they leave, the abuser will just find them and harm them there. No matter what they do, they're ultimately going to be abused more, and that's going to lead, to the paralysis. They might also lack material and or social resources to leave, right? So maybe they don't have a college education. Maybe they don't even have a high school education, right? So they can't really get a job. They can't really support themselves in any significant way. Maybe they don't have friends and family, right? Oftentimes abusers have isolated the abused person from their friends and family, whether that's sort of explicitly by saying like, oh, I don't want you being in touch with those people or else I'll harm you. Or maybe it's something more like shame, right? Where they feel like, I can't tell my family what's going on. I'm so embarrassed, and so I can't reach out to those people. Whether they could or not, right? They feel like they can't. And this is just getting at that, right? They're too humiliated to reach out to family or friends. Maybe they don't think their family or friends will believe them. They think like, oh, my partner always puts on a good face around these people, and so they're not going to trust me when I say that I'm being abused, like that. And ultimately, right, there's this fear of retaliation. I've suggested that in some of my comments about the previous ones. They're just worried that even if they send their abuser to jail, right, say they get them arrested, well, the abuser is going to get out of jail at some point. They're going to be out. Maybe they're going to be more angry than they ever were before. So there's really this sense of powerlessness, I think, here, and that's the important thing to emphasize. And how do you get out of that, right? Other than maybe the way that Janice did, right, by killing your abuser. So that leads us back to the central legal question in the case. So in order to determine whether Janice's belief that she was acting in self-defense was reasonable, should juries look to what a reasonably prudent person in Janice's position would have thought, an objective standard of reasonableness, or should they take a look at use the subjective standard of reasonableness by looking to what it was reasonable for Janice to think? Okay, so that's the question that I would put to you, right? In order to determine whether Janice's belief that she was acting in self-defense was reasonable, should juries look to an objective standard of reasonableness, or should they look to a subjective standard of reasonableness? And again, sort of the way I've put this question maybe makes it seem a little bit more complex than it is. But the question is just like, when we're evaluating whether or not we're going to excuse Janice, right? Should we excuse her only if her belief is objectively reasonable, or should we excuse her even if her belief isn't objectively reasonable as long as it's subjectively reasonable? That's another way to put it. So think about how you'd answer that question. What do you think the law should be? What should the juries be considering here? The objective reasonableness or the subjective reasonableness? And then, can you give reasons for why you have that view? And then once you've done that and done some of that work on your own, we'll look to what the court said. So how did the Supreme Court of North Dakota rule? Well, in an opinion written by Justice Vandewaal, the court ruled that juries should look to what it was reasonable for Janice to think. That is, they should look to a subjective standard of reasonableness when they're evaluating whether or not someone should be excused for killing in self-defense. In the opinion, he writes, a defendant's conduct is not to be judged by what a reasonably cautious person might or might not do or consider necessary to do under the like circumstances. So we shouldn't look to the objective standard. Rather, we should look to what that person, he himself in good faith, honestly believed and had reasonable ground to believe was necessary for him to do to protect himself. So rather than looking to what sort of an objectively reasonable person would think is necessary to do, like if I were in that situation, right, maybe I would call the police rather than killing Chester. But the fact is, I don't know exactly what it's like to live with battered woman syndrome, and I don't know, I don't really fully appreciate the psychological state that Janice was in. So what we should look to is what Janice, in good faith, believed and had reasonable grounds to believe. Right? So it's not just that she believed it, but that, in a sense, her circumstances really were pointing her towards it was reasonable for her to think this, given the kinds of experiences that she had had. If she thought that that was necessary to kill Chester in his sleep, right, to protect herself, then that's what, then maybe she should be excused for that. So if we want to sort of symbolize, or not symbolize, but put Vandewaal's argument into standard form, we might put it like this. So I think he's going to point to sort of 3 reasons for thinking that we should take this subjective standard. First, he says judicial precedent speaks in favor of the subjective standard of reasonableness to evaluate the accused person's beliefs, person's beliefs in cases of self-defense. That standard seems more just, so that's kind of a moral point, right? That seems like the more fair standard. And finally, that the standard is consistent with the law of self-defense, so there's nothing sort of in the law that would prevent us from using that standard. Premise 2 says that if that's true, right, if the subjective standard has precedent in its favor, if it seems more just, and if it's consistent with what the law says, then he concludes that that the trial court should have used that standard of reasonableness to evaluate the accused person's belief, in this case Janice, and therefore the trial court should have used a subjective standard of reasonableness to evaluate the accused person's beliefs. We get another quote here. So if the accused is a timid, diminutive male, the fact finder must consider these characteristics in assessing the reasonableness of his belief. If, on the other hand, the accused is a strong, courageous, and capable female, the fact finder must consider these characteristics in judging the reasonableness of her belief. So I think what he's saying here is like, this isn't just about women and men, it's about the particular details of the situation. So if someone's a timid, diminutive male who suffers, who lives with, right, battered woman syndrome, right, presumably this syndrome is not something that only women can experience. Men could experience it too, right, if they were abused. Then that's one thing. If we have a woman who doesn't live with battered woman syndrome, but rather they're strong, courageous, capable female, then it's unreasonable maybe for them to think that they need to kill their husband in their sleep, whatever. So it's not about men or women, it's just about the particular physical and psychological characteristics of the person. Now, ordinarily I would show a clip from an episode of Bull. I don't know if anybody has watched Bull. I think the guy's name here is Michael Weatherly. Anyway, it's a fun, interesting show. There's an episode that's about battered woman syndrome, and we get this opening scene where a woman is abused and then ends up killing her husband in his sleep after the incident. And I think while talking about Janice doing this, it seems like, oh my gosh, how heartless, killing your partner in his sleep. I think seeing the video of what this might really look like helps you sort of empathize with the abused person in situations like this. And when you watch this clip from Bull, you can't help but go away thinking like, yeah, that was right. I don't feel bad for the abuser in this case. So maybe we'll take a look at that if we get a chance in class. But it's worth sort of seeing those real life depictions help you really appreciate what's at stake in cases like this. Okay, so I want to leave you with this question. Should people who live with battered woman syndrome, people like Janice Leidholm, should they be excused for acting in self-defense even if they weren't in danger when they killed their abusers? Or should they not be, right? Should we send them to prison? Should we punish them? We can see why maybe like the retributivist kind of argument says, no, we shouldn't punish people like Janice Leidholm. We should excuse them. She was put in this really bad situation. She acted reasonably. That's all we can ask of people. But we can also see a kind of utilitarian argument maybe on the other side that says, well, we really don't want women killing their husbands in their sleep. We want them calling the police. We want them turning them in. Maybe we should fix something else about the system to help these women. We don't want a situation where they're just always going to be excused for killing their husbands, their abusive partners in cases like this. So that's the question that I want you to think about, and we'll talk about it later. All right, have a good one.